I'm Jason Wright, and this is the Texas Titans Podcast. Just like the name of the podcast suggests, I will be visiting with Texas Titans of business, academia, sports, or whatever their chosen field, looking for the disciplines and habits that have made these Texans so remarkable. Success leaves clues, and I want to crack the code to these Titans' success and share it with you. Thank you for joining me here on the Texas Titans Podcast. Hello, folks, and thank you for joining me for this episode of the Texas Titans Podcast. I got to say, these interviews just keep getting more and more fun, and this is no exception. This is an interview that I did with the CEO of CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates, Vicki Spriggs. Not to be confused with Vicki Briggs, which I called her in this interview right after I had said Vicki Spriggs. And so, yeah, that was pretty embarrassing because Vicki is awesome, and she is definitely someone whose name I never want to get wrong. But anyway, hey, interviewer's mistake. Please give me a little grace. This was a great interview. I want you to go after this interview and please learn more about Court Appointed Special Advocates, CASA. It's an incredible organization. It is doing great things for young people who are going through one of the most traumatic situations in their entire life. So please go check out CASA, find out how to get involved, how to volunteer, and how to possibly become a court-appointed special advocate. You don't have to be an attorney. They're just looking for volunteers. You go through some training, and you can be the single point of reference for a lot of these kids during this really troubling and traumatic time in their lives. So great organization, but I want to give you the bio on Vicki before we get into the interview. Vicki Spriggs, Texas CASA Chief Executive Officer, is a dedicated advocate for children who has worked for more than 43 years in the child services arena. Known for her leadership on youth-related issues, Spriggs is a national speaker, a decisive leader, and a fierce believer in the rights of all children, especially the right to a safe, loving, and permanent home. Prior to joining Texas CASA in January 2012, Spriggs served in a variety of positions dedicated to child welfare, including as a foster parent, director of the Travis County Juvenile Court Informal Adjustment Unit, and executive director at Texas Juvenile Probation Commission. She received a bachelor's degree in education and master of education in juvenile justice and secondary counseling from the University of Massachusetts. Vicki is an incredible human being, a great leader, and I really think you're going to enjoy this interview with my friend Vicki Spriggs, CEO of CASA, on the Texas Titans Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. This episode of the Texas Titans Podcast is brought to you by Hot Tots, Hautetotz, Hot Tots in La Piazza Shopping Center on Old Bullard Road in Tyler, Texas. At Hot Tots, they have such wonderful brands as Tea Collection, Buford Bonnet, and many others. They have an incredible toy section which features Melissa and Doug, Lego, and coming shortly, Nerf. So if you need toys, if you need baby gifts, if you're expecting, whatever you need for your newborn through preteens, Hot Tots is the place for you. You can visit Hot Tots online at hottots.com, where you can shop online, or you can stop by at 4855 Old Bullard Road, Suite 103, right behind Broadway Square Mall. Hot Tots is the absolute most incredible place for your newborn, your preteen, and anything in between. Please visit Hot Tots, one of my favorite sponsors ever. Well, welcome to this episode of the Texas Titans Podcast. I am very excited to introduce my listeners today to Vicki Spriggs, who is the CEO of CASA Texas. CASA stands for the Court Appointed Special Advocates. This is an organization that does incredible things, making a difference in the lives of not only just young people, but also the families that they belong to, and really assisting in the life transformation of children. And I'm going to let Vicki go into that. But Vicki, good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Jason. Thank you for having me.
Well,
it's a pleasure.
I am honored to be speaking with you. And first of all, let's just start at the beginning. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? Kind of where did Vicki Briggs start her journey?
Super. Let me start with Spriggs because it's easy to say Briggs. And
I said it sounded like Briggs. I said Spriggs. I've got it in front of me to make sure.
Okay. Well, I grew up in New York. I was an IBM brat, and I tell people being an IBM brat is like being an Army brat. You move to a bunch of different places, and since IBM's headquarters at the time was in New York, upstate New York, I've lived in Poughkeepsie, Wappingers Falls, Staten Island, the Bronx, Manhattan, Mount Vernon, and then Chappaqua was where I was living when I went away to college. Okay. I went into college at 16 thinking I was going to be a language major because I was pretty good in French and fluent in Spanish. And I thought if I was a language major, I could do anything and travel the world and do anything. And when I got to college, I realized after going through a few different majors, you had to read the classics in French and Spanish, and I didn't like the classics in English. So I switched my major, and language became my minor, and I went into hotel and restaurant administration. Only I hate to cook, and hotel and restaurant administration majors had to start in the kitchen in terms of learning pots and pans. Not a love of mine. So I quit that one. So now it's my first summer. By the way, I went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, my father's alma mater. So now it's my first summer, and I'm looking for a job, and I found a job in a halfway house for kids, and I loved it. I had Puerto Rican kids on my caseload, so I was able to use my Spanish, and by working with these young people, I found out I was great with working with young people. And so when the fall semester started, now my sophomore year, I asked if we had, first, during the course of the job, I said, well, this is great. Is there a real job like this? And they said, well, yes, there is. I said, well, what is it called? And they said, well, it's called juvenile probation. I said, juvenile probation? I had no concept of the world of what happens when people got in trouble with the law.
Right.
I was like, so what is this probation? Okay. What's juvenile probation? Okay. So what does one study when one wants to major in juvenile probation or get into that arena? They said, well, you study juvenile justice. I said, well, do we have that? And it just so happened that the University of Massachusetts at Amherst was the only college in the nation that happened to have a juvenile justice major. And so that semester, I enrolled in the juvenile justice major and actually have been a child advocate since the age of 17. I'm 63 now. So that's kind of my trajectory, and everything I've ever done has been related to advocating for children, most of it through the juvenile justice system. In fact, I spent 16 years running the state's Juvenile Probation Commission. And I did that from 95 till 2011 when I retired from the state.
Okay, very good. So you started out on kind of a traditional business path it sounds to me like it kind of found you. Your vocation kind of found you. You realized you had a heart and a desire for this, and you pursued that. And that's one of the things that I talk a lot about on the podcast. And for some reason, a lot of times when we're talking about business success, leadership success, we talk about, well, find your passion and you'll never work a day in your life. And it sounds like, okay, doing something that's just purely private sector, entrepreneurial, but it sounds to me like you decided to take your business acumen and your background and you match that with a passion for helping the lives of young people and turning that into a career. So when this happens, kind of what age are you around this time?
17 when I first start in juvenile justice arena, yeah.
And tell me what that was like. Tell me the things that opened your eyes the most, not just to, not the horror stories, but maybe some misconceptions that people have about young people that find themselves in the juvenile detention centers, the kind of that part of the world that a lot of us aren't exposed to. Tell me some of the things you saw that really opened your eyes.
I saw beautiful, talented, intelligent children, young people, who really had a set of circumstances in their lives that didn't equip them to deal in the world with the social skills that most children are able to grow up with. And as a result, they made bad choices. Mm-hmm. And really, I'm going to transition to the CASA world for a second because so many of the kids I saw in the juvenile probation system are children who could have and should have been in either states, Massachusetts or Texas's, depending upon where I was, child protective services system, but for their age. Many of them, their circumstances were found when they were older. And the state at that point would say things like, well, they're old enough, they can handle this.
Right.
And so these young children, these young people were left to their own devices. And sometimes the smartest thing they could do was get in trouble so that the system would then take them in and take care of them, because then they knew they would have housing, they'd get an education, they would be safe, and they'd be fed.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I've met some I met a young man who was a murderer. And he was one of the nicest kids. He killed his mother's abuser.
Oh, my goodness.
He ended up in the juvenile justice system with this label on him, and he was a fantastic young man.
Wow. Now, from an organizational leadership standpoint, so as you delve off into such a critical role, and you find yourself kind of moving towards leadership within these organizations, I read this book, Toxic Charity, whenever I was helping co-found a faith-based intermediary in East Texas. And one of the things we find is that there's a lot of people with the best of intentions that get involved in these programs, these organizations, but they don't have the skill set and the ability to turn desire, passion, and in a lot of instances, just pure compassion into actionable items that lead to good outcomes. How have you as a leader gone in and pragmatically assessed the situation to go, okay, tell me what your strategy is. Do you start with the child? What we call it at the Hand Up Network in East Texas, for instance, we call that a client. They would be the client if they come to us. Do you start with the client? How do we better their lives? Is it let's get the organization right and the employee focus right and make sure we get the right people in place? Kind of tell me what your strategy is whenever you go into one of these organizations to lead to the best outcomes as the leader of the organization.
Sure, thank you. And let me just start with a couple of things. First, my mother was a huge civil rights activist. Mm-hmm. And so she was organizing marches in upstate New York, and Thomas Rockwell, Norman Rockwell's son, was a good friend of hers and one of her soldiers. She was the general, who was the soldier. Pete Seeger, I don't know if you remember Pete Seeger, was one of her soldiers as well. But I remember, I wasn't thinking about it at the time as a child, watching her with her soldiers get things lined up for the marches they were going to have in Poughkeepsie at that particular point in time, Poughkeepsie, New York. Uh-huh. And so you don't know as a child what you're taking in. When I moved out into the work world from 17 on up, it was never my goal. I mean, my goal wasn't to run anything. It was just to do what my heart led me to do.
Right.
So I say, in other words, I took one job in the course of my life for money and said, I will never, ever do that again. Putting that aside, to answer your question most directly, the first thing I do is make sure we're all, wherever I am, that we are all working for a common purpose. And the common purpose would be better outcomes for the children that we're serving. Okay. And that's the starting place. Anybody who's not there, I say, you don't need to be on my boat, because my boat is sailing for children. Whether it was juvenile probation or Texas CASA, we are here to make the world better for children, to make their lives better. And if that's not what you're there for, then you need to find where your passion is, because it's got to be someplace else, because it's not here. Having said that, I also recognize that your passion may be media arts, and that may be your passion. Mm-hmm. And so there's a place for that passion in this world for children. And if you're able to blend that passion with this mission, we're good. But if your mission is about making money and getting a title, then that's not the person that's going to find a place with me.
Right, right.
And so first it's organizational culture, because if your culture is askew any product you put out is going to be disjointed
Mm-hmm.
because it takes teams working together well to produce quality products to make the transformations you want to see happen. Because when people are unhappy where they are, there's dissension, people are fragmented, creativity isn't where it needs to be. And then the mission and the product that comes out is not as good as it could have been. And so I start with the organizational culture.
It's interesting you say that, Vicki, because I literally just interviewed for the upcoming episode a gentleman by the name of Britt Barrett, who's the former CEO of Medical City and the author of a book called Patients Come Second. And he says the exact same thing, that if you want to make sure, like in his case, in healthcare and running large multi-bed hospitals, if you want to make sure that the patient gets the best care, you got to make sure you got the right culture and you've got people working towards more of a purpose, not just kind of the punch the clock, 9 to 5, get in and get out. And especially in the work that he does in healthcare, what you're doing and transforming the lives of these young people, I think that's critical. Now, you'll find throughout the interview, chronologically, I may jump all over the place, but you've said a couple of things about you went to your dad's alma mater. Your mom was a civil rights activist. I want to know, tell me about the childhood that you experienced, because it sounds to me like you had some incredible role models in the house that led you to do some of the things that you're doing now. So kind of tell me about I want to know what Sunday morning looked like. I want to know what the dinner table looked like. I want to know dad's lectures, mom's lectures, kind of how they reared you to shape you into the leader that you are today.
I love the question because it makes me smile because both my parents have recently passed. And I had a wonderful childhood. I have 5 sisters. So it was like growing up in a dormitory.
Wow.
And yeah, wow is right. In fact, when I went to
Your
college,
dad was outnumbered.
Don't you know? And when I went to college, it was the first time I shared my bedroom with only one person. So that was pretty cool. So growing up was like a dorm. And my parents, Sunday morning Sunday morning was about going to church. We were raised Catholic. And so we'd go to church, but my mother was also big on having us explore other religions. And so she might take us to temple one day and then a Baptist church on another Sunday and then back to the Catholic church. So we would church hop. And her premise was you will go to church until you're 16. And after 16, whether it's church, temple, mosque, whatever religion you choose or no religion, that's up to you. Right. But my job is to make sure you have that exposure. And that's what she told us all. Dad worked, Ma stayed home until the last of us went to kindergarten.
Okay.
And then she went to work. Dad was all about the business, and he would talk about business, and he would talk about the things that the challenges that he would encounter at IBM, because whether your viewers can tell it or not, I am an African-American female. And so my father found himself in the position of, a lot of times, both my parents actually, being the only African-American or one of few in a predominantly white business environment.
Yeah.
And so they would talk about those challenges. And my mother was also very big on history and knowing your history as an African-American, because she said that would empower you going forward. And so the family was, vacations to the Cape during the summer. We'd all pile into so growing up in New York, you don't need a car, right? Everybody knows that. At this point, we're in New York City proper. But my father had a Volkswagen station wagon that we'd all pile in, and we'd leave the house at like some ungodly hour, like 3 o'clock in the morning, to drive up to the Cape. And we'd stop at Howard Johnson's for breakfast, and that was always a cheap thrill. And then this is all 5, all 6 of us piling to the car, and then my parents in the front seat. So it was a tight ride with luggage and everything. And then we drive up to the Cape, Howard Johnson in the morning, and then check into the cottage and spend the next couple of weeks up there every summer. So we were close. My parents were amazing. And I think they led me to try to create family wherever I am.
Mm.
And I think, you don't really spend time thinking about this, but it also led me to want that for every child, that positive kind of environment for every child. It wasn't until college, when I got to college, I found out there were people who had siblings they hated. And I didn't understand that. How do you not talk to your siblings?
Right.
This is your brother or your sister. How do you hate somebody you're born with? But I found out that was a dynamic that I was not familiar with and didn't want to know. I mean, needed to hear,
Right.
but didn't want to have to experience. And so I think part of everything I do is about creating that family for these young people so that they can have that in their lives, because it is the basis of strength. If you have a solid foundation behind you, you can do anything. At least that's my belief. And that's the belief I carry forward into everything I do. And so wherever I go, I try to create that sense of family, because wherever I go, I want people to know they can do whatever they want to do.
Right.
Because they've got that basis behind them, that base that they stand on, so to speak.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, tell me about now, where do you fall amongst your siblings age-wise? Are you right in the middle, or where are you?
Exactly, right smack dab in the middle. So the first three of us were literally like 1, 2, and 3.
Okay.
And my mother would say when the 3-year-old was speaking, the 2-year-old would be between baby talk and adult speak, and I would be baby talk. And so my sister right above me would translate to my oldest sister, who would translate to my mother that Kiki, which is how I'm known at home, Kiki has a stomach ache. And then after me, it was a year and a half apart, a year and a half apart, and a year and a half apart. But so I'm the peacemaker, so to speak.
Right. Well, very good. And okay, so how long did you stay out on the East Coast before you moved a little further west?
College.
Okay.
I did my undergraduate and graduate at UMass, but during my undergraduate graduation day, it was May 18th of 77, it snowed. May 18th.
Wow.
Middle of May, and I'm talking full-on blizzard. And I was upset because I don't like cold weather. Never have, never will. And so I'm looking out the window at this snow saying, oh my God, I'm not in Alaska. I am not supposed to be looking at snow in the middle of May.
Right.
But I was already accepted into grad school, so I finished up my master's. And then my plan was to go to California and start looking around out there. I didn't know anybody out there, but I'd start looking. I figured my plan was go out there, look around. If I found a spot I wanted to be, I'd stay. If I didn't, I would just kind of work the coast and then just slowly work my way back east, because I could always be in New York because I had family. And as it turned out, I got a job I was sitting in a bar in Northampton at Massachusetts, which is right over from Amherst. And Fitzwilly's, for any listener who knows that area, was the restaurant. And a friend of mine came up and said, hey, Vicki, you still going to California? I said, yeah. They said, you have a job? I said, no. They said, you know anybody? I said, no. They said, well, I heard about this great job at Old Dominion University. They're looking for a student discipline specialist. I said, really? Where's ODU? And they said, well, it's in Norfolk, Virginia. I said, okay. They said, well, here's the information on it if you want to check it out. So I called and checked it out, got that position. And as I always tell people now, I tell people whenever you're being interviewed, you have to have intelligent questions to ask the interviewers. Well, during the course of my interview, my intelligent question was, after everything else was said and done, tell me about your weather. Does it snow there? And the person on the phone said, no, it doesn't snow, but if it does, it goes away very quickly. I said, great. So I took the job. I go down there. I'm a student disciplinary specialist, and I'm studying discipline problems in the Norfolk public school system. Norfolk, of course, Norfolk, Virginia, has a very large naval base, and you have these families that are broken up because the dad goes off or the mom goes off into the Navy. They're gone for months at a time. In the meantime, the family dynamic shifts because whoever's the mom, usually the care provider, is the one setting all the rules, and dad comes back home, and now the family's turned upside down. So all these disciplinary problems are showing up in the school system. So my job was to work with the school and the parents and the kids to kind of shape that up. it was a 2-year federal grant. Both years I was there, they had a major blizzard and had to call out the National Guard and close down the city.
You're
Yeah, exactly.
kidding me.
No, I'm not. Close down the city for a week at a time. I'm like, this is ridiculous. You all promised me it didn't snow here. And so the grant gets funded for another 2 years. And by now, I'm the assistant director of the project. And they say, well, Vicki, we got funded for another 2 years. You're going to stay? I said, no. You lied. I'm out of here. I can't do winter. I'm done with winter. And so I go back to plan A, which is go to California, look around, find a place I want, and then, or not, but start that way, go far west and work my way back east. So when I'm getting ready to go, my mother calls and says, hey, will you since you're going to fly over California anyway, would you kind of make a detour and visit Irma, a good friend of hers, who lives in Austin, Texas? And I said, sure. And so I land in Austin in May of 81, and I'm looking around, and it was beautiful. At that point in time, Austin was a big town.
Right.
I love big towns. There was no traffic problem. The night sky was black velvet with diamonds, and the daytime sky was the unpolluted blue that was, we once upon a time knew about and saw. And so I fell in love with Austin. And in trying to find my mother's best friend's house, I got turned around, but I met the nicest people in Austin who were trying to help this poor little Yankee child find her way to where I was going. And what I learned was two things, that Texans, at least the Austinites and all Texans generally, are really, really nice people, but couldn't give directions worth a hoot because the directions were like just things I'd never heard of before. So but I finally got to Irma's house, my mother's friend's house, and got a chance while I visited with her to really look around Austin and decided I wasn't going to go to California. I was going to live in Austin. So I went back, and this is May of 81, went back to Norfolk, finished out my term on my part of the grant, packed up my stuff, and I tell people like the Beverly Hillbillies, you loaded up the truck and you moved to Beverly.
Right.
I loaded up my car and drove down to Austin, Texas, and got here July 4th of 1981. And I've been in Austin ever since. But I've traveled the state multiple times since then.
Black velvet with diamonds. I think that might be one of the most beautiful descriptions of a clear night hill country sky that I've ever heard. That's that should be a song or something.
Really, because I tell you, it just struck me. It was gorgeous.
Wow.
It was beautiful.
And that, I used to say, so I grew up going out to hunting in Southwest Texas, and I used to tell people literally at night, it feels like you can just reach up and touch the stars. It's so clear. And yeah, to harken back to days when Austin looked like that, oh my goodness, because that's not the case anymore. It is so crowded. It's become so popular, but it's still a really cool city, is it not?
It's a cool city, but I tell people, if I were to fly into Austin now, I would do my visit. I would have a great time, but I would get on the plane and I would leave.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The traffic, the people are still awesome. The art scenes are still awesome, but the traffic is just unbearable.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. Mopac is kind of almost a curse word around Austin. That's for sure.
No, well, 35 is the curse word.
Yeah, that's the truth.
If there were numbers that would curse your life, they would be 3 and 5 in that order. And Mopac, do you remember when Mopac used to be, when it didn't go as far as it did, but if 35 had a little bit of traffic, you took Mopac, because nobody really took Mopac. And now Mopac is just as crowded as 35, which is just as crowded as 360.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, maybe by hearing this podcast, some of the East and West Coasters will reconsider flocking in, because right now they keep coming, and it just gets more and more crowded. All right. So what are you doing in Austin at this point? Kind of take me through your trajectory from landing in Austin. You decide this is where home is going to be, to your journey to CASA. What's going on there?
So believe it or not, let's see, this is July 4th of 81. So I actually, when I first got here, I actually started working 3 jobs to make the money I was making in Norfolk, Virginia. So I didn't want to make less. I didn't mind doing more, but I didn't want to make less. So I'm working 3 jobs. And then ultimately I work 1 job, which is running a modeling agency. So I do that for a while. That's all fun and games because I could do it. But it was during that time took a position as an admissions counselor for the University of Texas at Austin. That was 82, and did that for a year. And during the course of that time, I started, of course, traveling around the state recruiting. And again, juvenile justice background, I'm now talking to teenagers again, and I loved it. And I also realized that the kids I was talking to at college night were the kids who were going to be all right.
Right.
But my forte and my interest were the kids who weren't going to be all right. And so I moved on. But before moving on, I do want to note that I had the highest matriculation rate of kids coming out that I recruited, because they gave me predominantly African-American schools. And so when I got those kids in, these were kids that were destined, they were going to be successful. And I gave them the tools to be successful. And my class was the highest matriculating class of that time. There's probably been more since me that brought in by a counselor, but that's all then. So during the course of my time at UT, I'm thinking, again, my forte is kids who aren't going to make college night. And so the Juvenile Probation Commission had just been established, and I found out about it. And so I went over to interview, and Bill Anderson, whom I love dearly, who's now who passed, about 12, 15 years ago. But Bill Anderson interviewed me. We sat down and we talked, and then he had me meet everybody on the staff. And ultimately, in October of 83, of 83, I start working for the Juvenile Probation Commission. And I started out as a quality assurance specialist, which means you check probation departments you monitor them to make sure they're operating in accordance to standards. And that organization, the Juvenile Probation Commission, set the standards. And we were the conduit for state and federal funds and provided training and technical assistance. And so I'm traveling around the state and I'm meeting everybody. And it was really funny because the first thing that struck me was, as a New Yorker, and I was still a New Yorker in pace and mind. And so I'd go into probation departments and I'd open up my briefcase and I'd start talking about what's, the standards and where are you and da-da-da-da. And I would get this. So, where are you from? I'm from New York, and I'd get back to business. So tell me about your parents. My parent. I'm sitting here thinking, my parent, what are you talking about? That's got nothing to do with business. Then I realized, okay, I had to slow it down because the pace was different.
Yep.
The work was getting done. The pace was different. The culture was different. And so I slowed it down, and I really, 169 juvenile probation departments across the state, and different, like everything else about Texas, no matter what county you're in, each county is somewhat to significantly different from the other in terms of personality and culture, and depending upon what part of the state you're in, it's different. And so really got to appreciate and explore the beauty and the difference that makes up Texas. So I did that, and then I left the commission for a year or two to head up the voluntary probation. Now it's called informal adjustment, but the voluntary probation unit of Travis County Juvenile Court, which is here in Austin, Texas. During that time, the training director of the probation commission leaves, so I go back as director of training and apply and get that position. So now I'm training people all across the state, which I love, because in my worldview, if you're getting as a trainer, you're going off to training too, but you're getting paid to learn and then give away what you know.
Right.
It was the best possible world, because I love to learn and I love to educate. And so as training director, I did that. And then I started taking on, because I had an interest in the legislative process. So I started doing some of the legislative advocacy for the organization. And then because I was concerned about our HR process, I started doing HR for the organization. And then the executive director leaves in 1995 during a juvenile justice session, just before a juvenile justice session, and the board of the commission asked me to become the interim executive director, which I did after talking to the deputy director of the commission. I'm getting in the weeds on this for one reason, and there's a simple lesson here. The deputy director wanted to be executive director, and he was an amazing person. And I was happy. I was thrilled to be training director because I got paid to learn and give away what I know. And so I said to him, look, I will do the interim. And when it comes time to be executive director, you'll have my vote. I'll do whatever I need to do to make you successful. So that was our agreement. So he would come around the legislature with me during that interim. Again, it's 1995, legislative session. I'm interim director. I'm bringing him with me because I want him to get legislative contacts. So that when he becomes executive director, he's got that leg up already. Well, about 3 weeks into it, he says to me, look, I didn't realize how much it took to do this. I am not interested in being director. If you want that job, it's yours. If you don't, I'll still do it. But if you want it, I'll back you. I said, nope, it's your job. Just keep coming with me. I got this covered. So we went through the whole session. We get to the end of the session, and someone who was not a good employee and not a friend of who'd been terminated, and not a friend of the commission, puts in to be executive director of the commission. And I couldn't have it. But this person had legislative clout. And so I went into my deputy director and I said, look, this guy is put in. You can't beat him. I can. I said, so I need to put in for this position, but I need you to tell me it's okay. Because if you still want it, I will do whatever I can to get you the position. But it's got to be you or me. But I know I can beat him. I don't know that you can. He said, no, you've got my vote, because the state probation departments were split 50-50. Half wanted me to have the position, half wanted him. He said, no, you get it. He said, and I'll get on the phone. And he got on the phone, and the board had a sweeping response from probation field saying, she's the one we want.
Wow.
And so we kept, I'm just going to call him the bad guy, out. And then the rest is history, because we got the organization tight. We got the probation field, which was starting to fragment earlier on under a prior administrator, cohesive, and then into that juvenile justice session unknown, and came out very, very strong, with legislators understanding. Because I was able to brand the organization, unify the field, and just move the probation agenda forward. Because up until that time, the state only knew the Texas Youth Commission, because millions were going into the Youth Commission, and not so much into the Juvenile Probation Commission, because juvenile probation is a county-operated function. And so it was supported primarily with county dollars, not state dollars. So the state put their attention on where the money was, TYC, which, as we all know, later on blew up because of all the sexual abuse and scandal that was associated with that. In the meantime, I'm with TJPC, and we actually won an award for being one of the best places to work in Austin during my tenure. So then it was time for me to retire, because the state wanted to consolidate the two agencies, TYC and TYC, after the scandal at TYC. And I said, I'm now able to retire. I was 54. It was like a good time to retire. It was kind of part of my life plan was to retire in the 50s. It was good. So I was ready to go. And just before I was ready to retire, someone came and told me about the position at CASA opening up. Now, I was aware of CASA because I'd actually done training for Travis County CASA at different points in time. And so I looked at the position and really had to pray on it, frankly, because in my mind, I was all set to spend at least a year hanging out on the beach with no shoes on, my denim shirts and my jeans, and just relaxing. And then this position came along, and it was like, oh my God, here's an opportunity to get all those kids who ended up in the juvenile justice system who didn't need to be there, to be able to help make those changes in their lives to keep them from getting that outcome.
Right.
So I prayed on it to decide, do I want to apply for this or not? And I finally decided I'm going to go ahead and apply for it. And if I get it, great. And if I don't, great. So I applied for it, and that ended up being funny because the Texas CASA board is comprised of people from around the state. And so when they had the interview date set for me, they had to cancel because all the board members couldn't get there that needed to be there. And it was during a legislative session. So I withdrew my name. I thought, okay, that's the sign from God, not my position. So I withdrew from the application process. And a couple of weeks later, when I'm sitting in Amarillo, because I'm up there doing a session visit with the probation department during the session, and the board chairman calls me and says, I understand you withdrew your application. I said, yes, I did. He said, are you interested in the position? I said, yes, I am. He said, well, we'd like to interview you. I said, no, you don't. He said, what do you mean? I said, I am the interviewee. My schedule is erratic. I can't ask the interviewer to adjust to my schedule. That's why I'm pulling out. He said, but you are still interested in the position. I said, yes. He said, but we want to interview you then. I said, no, you don't. I said, it's not fair. I can't ask you to juggle to accommodate my schedule. He said, well, Vicki, just call it a conversation. We want to talk to you. I said, okay. He said, give me 3 dates and we'll get back to you with one of those 3 dates. I said, okay. So we did, and then the rest is history. I've been here now for 7.5 years, and we're working on changing the world. And I tell people, we don't ask for much here. We just want to change the world.
Well, yeah, small ask,
Right? Yeah.
Well, okay, there's one thing. Okay, before we get into the nuts and bolts of CASA and the work you're doing there, which is so phenomenal, I want to go back a little bit. Whenever you're essentially saying you have an individual tell you, you should get this job, not me, and you exercise the character, the confidence, and the it's not common to see the way you handled that situation. Kind of take me through as a leader, because we know the old saying that there's no limit to one's success as long as they don't care who gets the credit. It sounds to me like you were exercising that, directly in that opportunity, but kind of as a leader, and I want the listener to hear this, especially those who are moving their way up through organizations right now, who, as you know, I'm sure you've seen it, people jockeying for position, jockeying for title, playing the political games, especially in the world that you've lived in there in Austin, where you see it firsthand in these government agencies, especially. It's just, I've been a part of them. How have you stayed grounded and realized if I just do the work, I do the right things, the good things will happen? Because it sounds like that's a common thread throughout your career. What is your thought process as you go through, as you're charting your career path and being able to maintain that self-assuredness that says, I'm just going to do the job and the position will find me whenever it's supposed to? Talk to me about that.
Well, actually, that wasn't something I consciously knew.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I took one job for the money. It was during my hotel and restaurant semester in that major when I had to work, you had to learn pots and pans. I was like, that's it. But during that semester, I took a job as the head of housekeeping. I didn't know jack diddly about housekeeping. And I'm supervising these women who had worked in housekeeping, and this was their livelihood. And for me, it's just a summer job. This is their livelihood, and here comes this kid coming in to supervise them. I don't even know their job, but I do know it's important to them. As I got to know them, I quit that position. I quit it because this was their livelihood. This was their, I don't know if it was their passion, but it was certainly their livelihood. And for
Right.
me, it was just something to do during the college semester.
Right.
And so I quit that position after like a month or two because I was disgusted with myself that I was in a position that was somebody else's livelihood that for me was nothing.
Right.
And I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. And then from that point on, it was just do what you love. And then what I learned was do what you love and, period. And you do never work a day in your life.
Right.
And I also learned as part of that, do what you love. And somebody once said, it's not the skill, it's the will. Because you don't even have to know exactly what you're doing, but if you're coming into it with the right purpose, then you'll figure it out. And then figuring it out, you're going to do the things, if you're doing what you love, you're going to do the things that somebody who's working for money won't do. And at the end of the day, that person who's working for money and the title usually is slovenly, they're
Mm-hmm.
lazy, their approach is, because it's driven by ego and not driven by cause, they're off purpose anyway. So they're not as strong as somebody who is working for a purpose and working on mission, working on cause. Um, and so it's not something I knew, it's just something I started to realize as I did it. And then what you find out is when you're working on cause, money's going to find you anyway.
Mm,
Because everybody needs money to live, but money's going to find you anyway. Because
right.
I've been in a number of positions where I was the cleanup person. You go in behind somebody and have to clean up,
Yep.
but you know how to clean up because you're working for a mission and you know how things should be.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible advice. And that's the sort of thing I really want conveyed throughout this podcast. So, well, now let's bring you to, so you reluctantly postpone retirement, which doesn't surprise me just from listening to you. I don't think retirement is going to suit you well anytime soon, Vicki. But you show up at CASA. Tell me what you find and tell me immediately kind of, okay, I've made an assessment of the organization. Here's what I want to execute. And before we get into that, I think let's describe to the listener exactly what court-appointed special advocates does, what its role is, what its mission is, beyond changing the world. How are you going to change the world? So give our listeners a little bit of understanding.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with CASA, court-appointed, special advocates. And what makes the advocates special is these are normal people from all walks of life who are trained to be advocates for children in our state's foster care system. The CASA volunteer is the only person whose focus is solely on that child. So whereas a child comes into the Child Protective Services system, there's some trauma at the home, whether it's abuse, physical, sexual, or emotional, or neglect, which is another form of abuse, because we've heard about those children who were locked in closets and fed under the door for years. So that's all abuse. These kids are removed from their home by the state and placed in the state's foster care system. As everybody has heard over the course of years, caseworkers have case loads, which means they're dealing with children with case loads of 40 and up. And so 40 and up of children who are coming from traumatized backgrounds, who require a lot of attention. The turnover for caseworkers is high. It's gone down in a few last couple of years, but it's still high. And so these children have different caseworkers over the period of time that they're in care. They're removed from their home. They're placed in settings that are generally very far away from home. So they're in unfamiliar environments. They have an attorney that's appointed who usually sees the child when it's time to go to court. So the child doesn't know the attorney generally doesn't know the child. And so all these spaces around the child are changing constantly. And then when the CASA volunteer is appointed, they are the constant for that child. They are the person that gets to know the child well and finds out what is it this child needs.
Okay.
And then they become the advocate in the court for what the child needs. So they're advocating for services. They're talking to parents and relatives, trying to find a place and a way to get that child back home when it's safe or appropriate. And if not, the direct home, maybe with relatives or people who are important to that child, which they call fictive kin. But get that child home. And if all of that is not possible, then the CASA volunteer is then looking at potential adoptive placements for that child as well. But that CASA volunteer is assigned to that one child or sibling set. But that's that volunteer's only focus is that child. And they become the lifesaver, if you will, for that child. So that's the CASA volunteer, and that's the CASA program. Texas CASA is the state membership organization. And I say membership, but it's really a bigger entity than that in terms of we are the conduit for state and federal funds. We distribute that to the 72 CASA programs that we have in Texas that collectively provide services to 219 of our state's 254 counties. So we're the conduit of state funds, state and federal funds. We provide training, technical assistance, public policy advocacy. So we work to create changes in law that will benefit all children in foster care, whether they have an advocate or not, and increase volunteer access to information if that's necessary and services for children. And then we innovate. There are a lot of things that we do, like the branding of the CASA name. For the longest time, people would hear CASA and they were like, well, do you paint houses? Are you a restaurant? Are you the theater group out of Fort Worth? We are none of the above.
Right.
And so we've had to go about in the last 4 years putting aside a significant amount of money to brand CASA. And we're going to continue to do that so that we want CASA. Our goal is that CASA become that household name like Boys and Girls Club, like the Red Cross. If you know them, you ought to know CASA, because we see ourselves as the premier volunteer opportunity for anyone who really wants to make a difference in the trajectory not only of a child's life, but of the state of Texas. On any given day in the last couple of years, there are 52,000 children in our state's foster care system. There's a saying that says, I just went blank on it and I use it every day. Children are the message that we send forward to a future that we might never see.
Wow.
If 52,000 children are in care and we don't prepare them adequately and give them the skills and the safe and loving home that they need to become the full human being they have the potential to be, then who we are sending forward to that future is going to be a damaged soul. And damaged souls are angry souls. And angry souls become potentially dangerous people, or people who are homeless, people who have a higher incidence of mental health and physical health ailments, who become people who draw on the tax system instead of adding to the tax system. And so I say all that to say, if you're interested in the future of a child, CASA is the place to volunteer. If that doesn't get you, if you're interested in the future of the state, especially when you're an old person in that future that we might never see, you want sound, healthy human beings around you, not people who are angry. And so for all of us, there are lots of reasons for people to consider volunteering to become a CASA volunteer. And then, of course, we always say, and if your time doesn't allow that right now, there are other ways to get involved. You can foster parent, you can write a check to your local CASA program, to Texas CASA, so that we can get it out to the local programs. You can be a mentor to a child, but we should all be invested in every child in Texas as if they are our child, because we want healthy young people going into that future.
Amen. Amen. Very well said. Now, as far as the advocates that the profile of the advocate, and let me ask you this: are there cases when the advocate actually fosters the child as well? So, is there a case where they go to the meeting with the attorneys or the whoever, the courts, and then they go home with their advocate? And does that happen, or are those separated? There's a foster side, and then there's the advocate. Kind of tell me what that looks like.
Exactly. Well, what you said at the end, there is a foster side and advocate side. If someone wants to foster, they cannot be a CASA volunteer.
Gotcha. Okay.
Unless if they're fostering a child from another state, maybe. But generally, no.
Okay.
Because that would be a conflict of interest.
Yep.
Because what you don't want to create is a situation where, as a CASA volunteer, you're actually able to cherry pick children. That is not to happen. The goal of the CASA volunteer is to get that child back home, whether it's family or kin, or, as I used the term earlier, fictive kin, somebody who's important to the child, who's invested in the child, may not be a blood relative, but someone that's close to that child and has known that child growing up and is determined to be a safe, caring, committed adult who's willing to take that child in. But if the advocate were, the volunteer were allowed to become the foster parent as well, that would, again, just create a horrible conflict.
Right. All right. Well, tell me this. So, okay, you kind of touched on it earlier. When we hear CPS, Child Protective Services, in our mind, we have an abusive household. There's something has happened, whether it's actual physical abuse, sexual abuse, whatever the case may be. The child gets taken out of the home. I think you mentioned, the locked in closets, and we know all those stories. But what are some of the misconceptions, not only about Child Protective Services, but also the families that are surrounding that child that is being removed? Because a lot of people, when I started doing a lot of volunteer work through what once was the Cornerstone Assistance Network, and now we have turned into the Hand Up Network in East Texas, we have been a part of moms in particular They've had their child removed from the home to CPS. They've now gained employment. They're going through the life transformation process themselves to try to get that child back in the home. And whenever you hear those stories, you realize it's not always just because mom or dad was abusing the child. There are a whole set of circumstances where CPS may step in. So what are some of the misconceptions around CPS, the family surrounding the child, and what you believe we could do to repair or fix some of those misconceptions and just have better outcomes through the entire process?
Super. So I think one of the first misconceptions would be the families. They're all bad people. They're not. A lot of times they're people who are in struggle themselves, who may be homeless. They have a child. The child is taken away because the family cannot provide shelter for that child. Sometimes a family is just in crisis, and so the child is removed. So you have good people with good intentions, and you have good people with good intentions and bad circumstances, addicted to pain medication. Didn't start out that way, but that's how they ended up. And now they're neglecting their child or abusing their child because of their short temper, because of not having access to drugs. So you see a wide variety of reasons why children end up in care, and it's not always because the parents are bad evildoers. I'm going to put that in air quotes. And I think that's one thing that misconception drives a lot of people to think, well, this child should never go home. It's like, no, don't say that. Because for starters, we've seen plenty of cases where the alcoholic single parent family, alcoholic mom, is the child removed from the home, and it's not until the child is removed from the home that the mother says, oh my God, this is my baby. I want my child, whatever, back. And it compels the parent into rehab services, and they actually stick to it because their child is that important to them. But up until then, when the child is still home, they haven't even gotten to appreciate the significance of what their addiction is doing to them and to their children. And so it's always about working with the family to find out what is really happening here, because you just can't assume it's a bad person. So it's finding out the backstory. The other misconception is Child Protective Services. And in fact, I always say that because people in the state, Child Protective Services, will tell you that the state is not a good parent. So when a child is removed from the home and placed in the custody of the state's foster care system and Child Protective Services system, the state assumes the role of the parent. Well, I say the first misconception there is foster care. Foster care is a nice, soft, loving term. Foster, you think of cuddly kittens and cuddly puppies, because that's a fostering kind of thing. But the foster care system is anything but soft and cuddly. It is a system that requires people to step up to be to step in to serve as a foster parent for a child who's experienced a trauma, which means at some point there might be some behavioral issues associated with that. And so we don't have enough foster parents in Texas. And then the foster parents that we have, many of them, it's like if the child acts up in a certain way, it's like, okay, you're out. So the child gets moved from placement to placement to placement. And so there's nothing soft and cuddly about the foster care system. And so the whole idea is early prevention, early intervention, building up the services that we don't have enough of in the state. So we don't have enough substance abuse counselors in the state. We don't have enough drug courts in the state that parents can go and get this kind of service prior to losing their child, or support them in their recovery if they've lost their child, but getting their child back. But if we had drug abuse counselors and therapists and other services around the state, and vocational services that would really take someone in off the street to help them gain that skill set. But it takes a special kind of service delivery model to appropriately engage people who are on the street and have been there long term, to bring them in and basically acculturate them to be able to
Hmm.
help them find a job and to be able to help them find and be able to actually operate in a living environment um, that is not on the street and is not in a violent area. So there are a lot of skills that are needed and a lot of services that are needed that we don't have enough of. We don't have enough adolescent counselors in the state. I think San Antonio has the most. But then as you look around the state, once you get outside the urban areas, very few. Um, so there are a lot of extra social service supports that would be beneficial in keeping families out of crisis generally. And if you can keep them out of crisis generally, you're less likely to have kids end up in the Child Protective Services system.
Well, and you said something there that a lot of people, my work with the homeless is something that really opened my eyes to what exactly homelessness is. And a lot of people, they have this misconception that, well, the homeless individual is the person we see on the streets, either curled up in a sleeping bag on a sidewalk, pushing a cart. They don't take into account the single mom who's been couch hopping. They first start with relatives or bad boyfriends, and then they end up in a motel. And if you were to ask that mom, are you homeless? Well, no, I'm not homeless. I slept on my friend's couch last night. We had a roof over our house. But yeah, they've probably been homeless for a while because none of the places that either she or her children have slept in the last, say, 5 months have been their home.
Yeah.
They are in fact homeless, and it's trying to find ways to remedy that problem before it ever gets to the point where now the mom is completely out on the street. The couches have run out, the friends, the family are gone, and the children have nowhere to go, and then they end up in CPS. And so I just say that as a message to the listener that this is a much deeper problem with more layers than most people understand. And I've got to believe with CASA, you see that all the time.
Absolutely. And, they say that most people are, two paychecks removed from being homeless.
Yeah.
And then we have a lot of people who are working full-time jobs and they're still below the poverty level. And so all it takes is one major disruptive event to put that family on the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have people who are well educated living in cars with their children because there was a major health issue or some disruption in their life that took away their living situation. And so there's chronic homelessness, and then there's that homelessness that's a result of, a person who's doing their absolute best to stay in housing, but it puts them out. It makes it unaffordable and just out of grasp, out of reach. So, yeah, there are multiple layers to that, and all those layers. I'm going to jump back to children for a second. All those layers come down on children. I know the school systems in Texas used to say if you didn't have an address, you couldn't register for school. They had to change that because there were so many homeless children.
That's right.
That they said, okay, you don't need to have an address. You can still come to school now. And it's like, well, thank you.
Right. Exactly. Because a lot of them, that's the only safe haven that they actually have for. And it's also the issue, Vicki, that I know I was reading an article or an interview that I think it was something that you had written that a lot of people take for granted is just the generational aspect of this. I mean, and I had what I consider a privilege of, I grew up in a broken home where literally I went from the proverbial right side of the tracks to the wrong side of the tracks on a week by week basis. I would be at my father's house one week, which was on the quote unquote good side of town, where the property that I grew up on had been in our family for a long time, to stay with my mom, where I rode bikes and hung out with the kids that were on the free lunch program, that were in their dads were barely scraping by, and it gave me an incredible view of the generational what those children saw 100% of the time and had seen for generations in the way they were growing up versus what I at least had the opportunity to go to on a weekly basis to say, okay, there's another example out there. And so I think that a lot of times we take for granted when you've never seen hope, love, stability. It does put that it ingrains in your brain a certain expectation of yourself and the life you're supposed to live that is hard to shake. And so for people that get that and understand it, kind of tell me, what is the process if I say, okay, you know what? I want to be an advocate for CASA. I want to do this. What is the process? I would imagine there's some training to go through, and then what is the time commitment? What does all that look like?
Sure. So you say you want to be a CASA volunteer, you come into your local, you can actually go online to becomeacasa.org, put in your zip code, and we'll tell you where the closest programs are to where you are. You can decide if you work in one town and live in another, you can decide where you want to volunteer. But you go into that office, they'll do an interview with you, and assuming that, like, some people during the course of the interview will say, yes, I want to be a CASA volunteer because I want to provide a good home for these children because I've got a good, stable life and we can do this. It's like, oh, it sounds like you really want to foster. So then we're going to direct you to fostering.
Okay.
Or they have something else that makes you say, oh, okay, you're really sounding like you want to be a big brother, big sister. Let me direct you over there. But if the person is really clear after we have that explanation about what CASA is, then they go to the next step. The next step would be the 30 hours of training that's required. We are learning about the court system, about how kids, what's happening in families, family dynamics. You're learning about, there's a whole segment of the curriculum on cultural diversity, because these kids are coming from families that some people have no clue of what that reality looks like. And then you're learning about the law. So you're learning about the different aspects of what it takes, how a kid comes in, and how do you work with that child once they're in the system. Once the volunteer goes through training, and during the course of training, we're also looking to see, how do you ask questions? How do you follow through on instruction? Are you timely? Do you keep your commitments? Because if you have someone who's just never showing up on time, or somebody who comes in but they smell like alcohol, that person's not going to make it to the next step. The next step is you finish the classes, and so we conduct a background check. The background check is necessary because you don't want somebody who has a history of abuse working with children who's been abused.
Sure.
And so once that background check is done, then you're part of that graduating class that's sworn in, usually by the area judge, but you're then sworn in as a CASA volunteer. And then you wait, and typically there are cases waiting for you to be assigned. And then once that case is given to you, you have a volunteer supervisor who's going to work with you and help you get to know that case and help you get to know that child and help direct your steps in terms of how do you go about providing quality advocacy for the child. And one caveat for everybody is this: because of what, and some of these are babies we're talking about. These are like a month old or less, days old. And some are 18, 19. Just depends on, when the case comes to you, or when this child is being assigned a CASA volunteer. But the one thing for everybody to know is there may be a time where you don't like the child because of the way the child acts. And the child, remember, just like what you talked about in terms of being able to see generational impacts and being able to see both sides of the continuum. Some children don't trust anybody because of all they've been through.
Sure.
So here you are, one more face. They haven't learned to believe in you yet because you're just showing up, and you're one more face that's just shown up. And we tell people, you don't have to like the child. Your job is to advocate for the best interest of this child. As you get to know the child, you may actually get to like him or her, and they may actually get to like you. But the goal for you is to be the best voice for this child in court, to find out what it is this child needs to be able to be made whole, healthy, safe, and to get that permanent living situation structured for that child. And to be that voice in court, to give the court what you've seen that leads you to this recommendation for what needs to happen for this child.
Do the advocates that work with children, do they establish long-term friendships? Is that allowed? Is that okay? Have you seen that? Do they become mentors later on? Does that happen?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it happens, especially when the child is older.
Yeah, yeah.
The child's older, been in care for a while, and that volunteer's been with that child for a while. They establish a relationship that, I was speaking to one young man whose volunteer was with him for years. And when the young man left care and he went on to college, he did great things, and he's got his own child now. And his CASA volunteer, he calls his child's grandfather.
Mm. Wow.
Because he talks about how his volunteer was there whenever he was at playing sports in high school. His volunteer, he said, no matter if it was raining or what, he would look up and his volunteer would always be there. We don't ask that of volunteers, but those volunteers make those connections, and a lot of them make that level of commitment. Now, when it's a young child, though, like a baby, we ask the volunteer, when that baby is adopted or returned home, your job is to transition away. Because that child's not going to remember you. It's a different mental health developmental cycle. A younger child is easily absorbed into another family system. You may transition away, but you're going to transition away. The older child, though, needs that transition. You become that cornerstone of stability. So even though we don't say you need to do this, for a lot of volunteers who've been with a child for an extended period of time, that is what happens. They maintain relationships over time.
Right, right. Well, Vicki, we are just a little over an hour, and before we kind of wrap up, I want to first of all give you the opportunity. Is there anything else that we need to know about CASA? Because I think that CASA is such an incredible organization. I want people to know about it. I want people to get involved with CASA. So is there anything else that we need to know that we haven't covered before we start to wrap up?
Yes, thank you. So we had almost 11,000 volunteers last year, but there are 52,000 children in care.
Wow.
Yeah. We provided services to just over 30,000 children last year. But there are a great number of children who still need a CASA volunteer. And again, it's the qualitative difference in this child's life. So we always, no matter where you are in the state, we need you to volunteer if you are so inclined. If you are not inclined because maybe you don't have time right now, and by the way, the average amount of time that we look for volunteers is about 12 to 15 hours a month. And a lot of that can be on the phone, because you're on the phone talking to the teachers, you're on the phone talking to the counselors, you're on the phone talking to the caseworkers. But you want to make those visits with the child. But those aren't 12 to 15-hour visits. Those are the cumulative amount of time commitment during the month, 12 to 15 hours. Most of that's on the phone talking to the other people in that child's world. So we always need CASA volunteers. If you can't volunteer, write a check to your local CASA program. Or stop by and just ask them what else you can do to help them.
Very good. Very good. Well, finally, here's a question that I ask every guest. So in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey, he has in one of the chapters, he describes that you're walking by a church, you hear music coming from inside, so you find yourself going in the doors, you look and you notice you're at a funeral, and you walk up, and in the casket, it's you. And you have to ask yourself, what do you want said when your career, life, it's all said and done? Vicki, what do you want others to say? How do you want to be known?
That I made a difference, a positive difference in the world. And that was actually an exercise I did when I was 15 in high school.
Wow.
And we had again, 15, I'm 63 now, so it was a long time ago when we still had rap sessions in school. RAP, so we were having this rap session, and the person facilitating the session did a similar exercise. And at that point in time, I decided I wanted to make a positive difference in the world. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that wherever I have been, I want to say I don't want to say it. I want other people to say I made a qualitative difference.
Wow. Perfect. Perfect. Well, Vicki Spriggs, to make sure that I don't drop my S and a P and replace with a P, Vicki Spriggs, In every sense of the word, you are, hey, you may be a transplant from the East Coast, but we're so glad you got here and you found your way in 1981 to Austin, Texas, because by all accounts, you are a Texas Titan. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for you to have spent this time with us. I'm so glad that our mutual friend, Mary Spaeth, who's also been on the program, put us together. And I want you to know that anytime, any way I can ever return this very gracious favor, please call on me. I'd be more than happy to. Thank you so much for being with me today. It's really meant the world to me.
Thank you, Jason, for having me and for being such a strong supporter of CASA, and then for absolutely knowing Mary, because Mary is incredible. Thank you
I
very
could
much.
not agree more. All right. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye, Vicki. Hey, folks, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Texas Titans podcast. If you liked what you heard, please take the time to go to iTunes and rate us. That's how we move up in the rankings. And this is a dream. It's a passion of mine. And I really want this to be successful. And I can't do it without you letting iTunes know what you think. So if you liked it, please go out there and give us a review. I would be so grateful. Also, please, if you would, follow me on social media. I'm at Jason Wright TX on Facebook, Jason Wright TX on Twitter, and I'm also at Jason Wright Now on Instagram. Please follow me on those platforms. And also, if you would, it would mean the world to me if you go to jasonwrightnow.com. That's my name, Jason, WRIGHT now.com, and download a free copy of my book, Push Play, Taking Your Life Off Pause. This is a book that I wrote after I escaped from corporate America, bought my first company, and really started to focus on the life I wanted to live as opposed to the job I wanted to have. It's a quick read. I mean, I wrote it, so the words are not that big. So please check that out and subscribe to my blog, which is Make Your Own Rules. This is where I take rules for life that I have gleaned from the actions of the most successful people that I've ever read about, I've met in person, people you wouldn't think of that just have these incredible life disciplines that I've incorporated in my life and that I think you will enjoy learning as well and maybe pick them up for yourself. So please do that. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for being on this journey with me. Those of you who have reached out to me in person through email, that have called to say that you like the podcast and have given me the encouragement that is so vital during this time of getting this thing going and started, I cannot thank you enough. And thank you so much for each and every person that I've interviewed thus far, for taking your time to introduce yourself, not only more to me through the interview process, but also our listeners. Thank you so much. So please go out, have a great day, a great week, and crush it no matter what you're doing. Thanks so much.